Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to this very important conference. It's nice to be out of the office on such a fantastic day. I suppose in the course of putting together my research for this talk, I discovered that we have now entered the sixth period of mass extinction, so I'm going to be rather brief. Fearing for the future. Unless we address the accelerating deterioration of our planet, its habitat and resources, it will be beyond repair. Personally, I find that a terrifying prospect. From a financial perspective, there are a huge number of assets around the world at risk. The question is why? Many investors are ignoring climate change, water shortages, resource scarcity, technological development, and changes in social norms. And that extends to divestment of fossil fuels, or stranded assets, as Bill mentioned, is what we call them. I believe this approach is myopic and unsustainable, and it's a huge challenge to try and turn this juggernaut around, but it's gratifying that there is so much support for conferences such as today, crossing a wide range of social groups. So, what do we know? We know that the top 100 environmental externalities are costing the world economy $4.7 trillion a year. And we know that 2/3 of the current fossil fuel reserves must stay in the ground if we're to have even a 50-50 chance of maintaining global temperatures rises to below 2 degrees. And that's 80% of coal reserves, 50% of gas, and 33% of oil that must go unused. That's what we know. However, knowing what we know, the reality is even more frightening. And slightly surreal. In 2012, 12,000 new coal-fired power stations were being planned around the world. In 2014, companies spent over 600 billion euros, that's 600 billion euros, on searching for and developing new fossil fuel resources. It's not just companies either that do it. G20 governments spend approximately $88 billion a year supporting the oil and gas exploration. And of course, I think it's well documented, it was featured in The Guardian not so long ago, that countries spend $550 billion annually on fossil fuel subsidies. These are the same countries that are going to gather at the end of the year in Paris and talk about how to solve climate change. It really would be funny if it wasn't quite so serious. Also, from the industry perspective, the top 200 oil and gas firms hold 5 times more fossil fuel reserves than can be safely burned to contain temperature. And these reserves have increased by over 10% in the last 5 years. This is the really scary piece. The annual survey of institutional investors that monitors exposure to environmental risk and management of environmental risk found nearly 50% of those large firms, and we're talking about firms like the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, one of the largest investors in the world, they make no effort to address or mitigate climate risk. So, I know that there are a large number of organisations, including Bill's, that are trying to agitate for the divestment of fossil fuels, and I genuinely applaud the work that is being done. But I'm, suppose, being a realist, I'm rather pessimistic about exactly how much impact it can have directly. And I think probably the focus is, my focus would be on capital, provision of capital. And I think that more and more companies, businesses and banks need to be drawn into the idea that we should be limiting the actual capital that's advanced to oil companies, aside from the equity issue. Of course, companies can't do that on their own, and I would be a very strong advocate of national and international action. First and foremost on my list would be to reduce fossil fuel subsidies to zero over a period of time, a short period of time. I think that we need to stimulate that the shift of that exploration capital that's currently being used to finance operations up in the Arctic and other areas towards low carbon technologies, things like carbon capture and storage, for example, and other green technologies. I also think from the regulatory perspective, it would be useful for a punitive capital weighting to be attached to bank lending to fossil fuels. If it's less of a good deal for banks to lend to fossil fuel companies, it simply won't happen to the extent that it is at the moment. And David Blood, who is an ex-banker turned ethical investor, he works with Al Gore, Blood and Gore, in generation asset management, has advanced the idea of promoting a fiduciary duty. And I can tell you that, in the current environment in banking, something like that would work. This idea that that the companies have a fiduciary duty to be totally transparent, and that's around integrated reporting, making sure that companies actually articulate what they're using from the point of view of their environmental and carbon footprint, and also from the point of view of the ordinary investor that's putting money into investment schemes, to be fully cognizant of what those climate risks, what the climate risks are of investments. As well as all of that stuff, which I suppose is the stick, we need to look at the carrot, and we need to be evangelical about the advantages of investing sustainably and in green technology. And CDP released a survey recently that found that amongst the S&P 500 companies, those that had a sustainable approach to their business actually outperformed companies that didn't by around 18%, and that's a significant return. I also thought during the course of what I was going to put together for you was around what would happen if a magic wand was waved and there was divestment on a massive scale without the sort of policy and industry supports that I've been advocating. And this is it, really. It's fairly stark. A revaluation of assets always results in market failure. And I suppose the most poignant thing for me is the fact that the recent global financial crisis that began in the States was precipitated by the failure of the subprime market, which was valued at about $1.3 trillion at the time. If, at the stroke of a pen, we have to accommodate stranded assets, that's going to be about 60 to 80% loss of asset value within the top 200 oil and gas companies, and the quantum of loss is about twice what we saw with the subprime. So what's the corollary of that? The corollary of that is financial instability, and well, sure, we've all been through the recession more recently, so we all know what the impacts are. From an Irish perspective as well, I think we'd have to be very careful. currently, Ireland imports 85.5% of its fuel. It's energy dependent to almost a ridiculous level. And the impact of a reduction in the value of oil companies would ultimately result in higher oil prices. So unless Ireland as a country is positioned to transition very quickly to a low-carbon economy and divestment actually occurs, the impacts on us are going to be very severe. So I suppose careful what one wishes for. I'm going to close there, and we can hopefully discuss some of the points I've raised in the discussion afterwards.